Prince Andrew has long lived under a cloud of controversy. But now a new development has delivered a blow that is both personal and deeply heartbreaking. Far from the spotlight of courtroom battles and royal scrutiny, this news strikes at the core of his private life, leaving him shaken and vulnerable. For a man already struggling to repair his image, the timing couldn't be more devastating. What tragic update has emerged about Prince Andrew? And why has it left even his critics momentarily stunned with sympathy? The making of Prince Andrew. From spoiled child to palace disgrace. Prince Andrew was born into a world of marble halls and golden ceilings. A place where rules were often bent at the feet of royalty. From birth, he was wrapped in privilege so thick that it seemed reality could never break through. But as the years passed, that protective armor became a prison of expectations until at 65. The carefully polished image of the Queen's dashing son crumbled into something far darker. A portrait of disgrace. The charming prince, once paraded as the monarchy's glittering soldier, had turned into its greatest humiliation. The whispers that circled him for decades weren't baseless attacks or overblown rumors. They were signs, clear, insistent warnings that those inside the palace refused to confront. Even as a child, Andrew's world revolved around a single truth. Rules applied to everyone but him. Before the tabloids, before the scandals, before the infamous interviews that would define his downfall, he was already learning a dangerous lesson. Those around him described a boy who tested limits, not out of innocence, but out of a sense of entitlement. At Windsor Castle, when he was barely 5, he strutted through the stable yard where grooms and guards worked hard. He jeered at the soldiers, mocking their rigid posture, swinging sticks at the horses' legs, even tormenting the dogs for his own amusement. When staff asked him to stop, he only grew bolder. Finally, 2 frustrated grooms lifted the little prince and dumped him into a manure heap, covering him with dung in a crude attempt at discipline. That moment might have reshaped another child. For Andrew, it reinforced something else entirely. That humiliation could pass, but privilege remained. Soon after, another clash cemented the lesson. He goaded a palace footman so relentlessly that the man, breaking protocol, struck Andrew in the face, leaving him with a bruised eye. It was a shocking act against a royal child. Yet when the footman offered his resignation, the Queen herself refused it, remarking that Andrew had deserved the blow. The servants stayed, Andrew healed, and an unsettling understanding took root. He could provoke others to violence and still remain untouchable. His true power lay in daring others to cross lines he himself would never pay for. These childhood episodes weren't harmless mischief. They became early sketches of the man Andrew would later become. The boy who mocked guards for their stiffness grew into the prince who demanded curtains drawn with military precision, berating staff for leaving even a sliver of daylight. The child who played cruel games in the stable yard became the man who insisted that his teddy bears be placed in strict formation, throwing tantrums when they weren't. To outsiders, these quirks seemed eccentric, perhaps even comical. But for palace servants who endured his tirades, it was abuse, petty, relentless, and humiliating. By the early 1980s, the contrast between Andrew and his sister-in-law, Diana, couldn't have been sharper. While Diana dazzled the world with grace and vulnerability, Andrew gained a very different reputation. He was supposed to be the charismatic younger prince, dashing in uniform, the bachelor royal who would charm nations with his romances. Instead, those who worked closest to him described a man both spoiled and arrogant, a prince who wielded his entitlement like a weapon. Charlotte Briggs, a former maid, recalled one humiliating encounter where Andrew erupted in fury simply because she left the smallest gap in his curtains. To him, it was an unforgivable mistake. To her, it was a reminder of his cruelty. The stories piled up. The stuffed animals arranged with military precision, the fits of rage over trivial mistakes. A grown man approaching 40, yet still behaving like the 5-year-old who once mocked soldiers in the yard. His parents' attitudes did little to help. The Queen's indulgence excused him, while Prince Philip, never one to hide his sharp tongue, dismissed him as the spare, a man always second to Charles, yet unburdened by the responsibilities of the crown. That freedom, meant to be a gift, became the soil in which Andrew's reckless nature flourished. And so, while his brothers learned restraint in the face of the press, Andrew embraced scandal. He flaunted his romances with actresses and models, his reputation as Randy Andy, and carried himself as if accountability was a word meant only for others. His wealth, his connections, his royal blood. These shields kept him untouchable, at least until the cracks began to spread. Until the prince, once celebrated as glamorous, became instead a man drowning in rumors, accusations, and ultimately shame. And from there, what began as childhood arrogance would spiral into something far more dangerous. A trail that led straight into the glare of a public scandal. That was just a teaser. Now comes the full story. Painful, disgusting details that will shake you. Are you prepared to face it? Stay glued. How Prince Andrew's reckless choices turned royalty into risk. When Prince Andrew married Sarah Ferguson in 1986, the ceremony looked like something straight out of a storybook. The nation celebrated, the press adored them, and the monarchy basked in the glow of what seemed to be a new chapter of stability. But fairy tales don't always last. Within just a few years, the marriage crumbled under the weight of scandal. Sarah was caught in compromising situations splashed across the tabloids, while Andrew carried on with his own reckless behavior that only deepened the cracks. By the time the divorce was finalized, their bond had become a bizarre mixture of separation and closeness, which only fueled more whispers. To the crown, Andrew was no longer a dependable royal. He had become unpredictable, volatile, and dangerously careless. The 1990s only worsened his reputation. While ordinary British families endured economic struggles and austerity, Andrew was globetrotting on the taxpayer's dime. Helicopters, private jets, and five-star resorts became his normal routine. The press branded him Air Miles Andy, mocking the millions he burned through in travel expenses. Investigations revealed not just excessive holidays, but also perks he extracted through his military status. For families who could barely afford heating, the sight of a pampered prince dismissing criticism as if his title granted immunity was infuriating. But the arrogance went deeper than money. Inside Buckingham Palace, whispers turned into certainty. Staff noticed how obsessed he was with status symbols, his uniform dripping with medals, his constant need to be seen at elite clubs, his desperate pursuit of glamorous women. Friends described him as gullible, easily fooled by flattery and forever chasing the illusion of importance. This flaw, subtle at first, would one day become the very weapon that dragged him down. By the late 1990s, his naval career had ended, leaving him adrift. To give him purpose, Andrew was handed the role of trade envoy, supposedly a chance to strengthen British business abroad. But instead of boosting trade, he entangled himself with dictators, shady businessmen, and dubious deals. American diplomatic cables that later leaked described him as arrogant, rude, and tone-deaf, embarrassing the very officials forced to work alongside him. The role meant to raise Britain's prestige became a stage for Andrew's private networking, trading his royal name for favors, access, and influence. What once was a symbol of military honor had now transformed into an emblem of greed. The press mocked him relentlessly. Yet Andrew walked with smug confidence, his safety net always intact, his mother's protection. Queen Elizabeth shielded him at every turn, paying off debts, smoothing over scandals, and convincing herself that preserving her son's dignity outweighed the mounting damage to the monarchy. But behind palace walls, staff saw the reality. Andrew was no longer just immature. He was a liability. His selfishness knew no limits, his behavior reckless, and the company he kept increasingly toxic. However, in 2024, a new allegation surfaced. This time involving a mysterious Chinese businessman known in court documents as H6, later identified as Yang Tembo. The UK government banned him from entering Britain in March 2023, labeling him a national security risk. Investigators discovered that H6 had managed to secure an unusual level of trust with Prince Andrew. Letters showed that Andrew's own advisor authorized H6 to act on the prince's behalf in dealings with potential investors in China. One letter even told H6 that aside from Andrew's innermost circle, he sat at the very top of a tree that many people would like to be on. It was a startling revelation. Authorities suspected H6 of having links to the Chinese Communist Party's influence operations, with documents on his devices showing attempts to use his connection with Andrew for political and business leverage. Andrew's office quickly insisted he had cut off contact the moment concerns were raised, claiming he only ever met H6 through official channels and never discussed sensitive matters. Yet the defense rang hollow. For critics, it was the same script repeated. Andrew only distancing himself once a relationship became too scandalous to hide. The parallels to Jeffrey Epstein were impossible to ignore. Once again, Andrew's judgment in Friends looked dangerously poor. Once again, he seemed unable to recognize when he was being used. And once again, his behavior placed the monarchy's image at risk. Even if he wasn't complicit in espionage, the optics alone were catastrophic. A senior royal, rubbing shoulders with someone accused of spying for a foreign power. The scandal didn't explode with the same lurid headlines as some of his earlier controversies. But within government and palace circles, the damage was just as severe. Questions multiplied. Could Andrew be trusted with any role at all? Was his need for validation so blinding that he would forever entangle himself with opportunists, spies, and criminals? If you think that's crazy, then you'll choke when you hear that Ghislaine Maxwell introduced him to Jeffrey Epstein. Stay tuned, because the Epstein scandals are about to unravel in ways no one ever imagined. Prince Andrew's fall from royal privilege to the shadow of Epstein. Prince Andrew had always been drawn to luxury. He craved the glittering lifestyle, private jets, lavish mansions, and the constant company of models, actresses, and wealthy elites. What he failed to see, or perhaps deliberately ignored, was the hidden cost of chasing such a world. When Ghislaine Maxwell introduced him to Jeffrey Epstein, the connection should have raised alarms. Epstein was already whispered about in high circles, his reputation tainted by dark rumors. Any cautious man would have walked away, but Andrew didn't. He leaned in. Greed and status blinded him. For those who worked around him, this wasn't surprising at all. Palace staff had long endured his outbursts, his arrogance, and his strange obsessions. To them, the world would one day see the true Andrew. The man who screamed at servants over misplaced teddy bears, who threw tantrums about curtains, and who demanded obedience from everyone around him. And when the infamous photograph of him with Virginia Giuffre, a teenager at the time, emerged, standing beside Maxwell with Andrew's arm wrapped around her bare waist, it wasn't shocking to those inside the palace. It was confirmation. But Andrew's ruin didn't begin with Epstein. His decline had been a slow burn, years in the making. By the late 1990s, his reputation had already soured. His divorce from Sarah Ferguson in 1996 should have offered him a fresh beginning. Instead, it set the stage for even greater humiliation. Months later, the press exploded with images of Ferguson having her toes sucked by her financial advisor while on holiday. The scandal embarrassed the royal family. But Andrew's refusal to distance himself from his ex-wife confused the public even more. For years after their divorce, Andrew lived on and off with Sarah, sparking endless speculation. Were they financially bound together? Was she shielding him, or was he shielding her? No one could say for certain, but the whispers never stopped. Meanwhile, Andrew clung even harder to his Randy Andy reputation, immersing himself in flings with actresses, models, and socialites. His supposed romance with Caprice Barrett only fueled the tabloids, though the relationship ended in ridicule. Once celebrated as a dashing young prince, Andrew had become a middle-aged caricature, mocked for desperately trying to cling to the playboy image of his youth. In 2001, the Queen tried to redirect him. She appointed him as Britain's special representative for international trade and investment. The role was meant to give him dignity, purpose, and a chance to serve his country. Instead, it gave him a license to indulge his worst habits. Rather than building bridges for British companies, Andrew turned the position into a personal empire. He traveled in private jets, stayed in luxury hotels, and surrounded himself with controversial figures. Stories emerged of his close friendships with dictators' children, including Saif Gaddafi, son of Libya's notorious Muammar Gaddafi. Questions swirled about why a senior royal was cozying up to autocrats. The truth came to light when leaked U.S. diplomatic cables in 2010 revealed how American officials truly saw him: arrogant, rude, and shockingly dismissive of corruption concerns. At a lunch in Kyrgyzstan, he stunned diplomats by ranting about journalists and insisting governments should ignore public opinion, instead of promoting British values. Andrew embarrassed his country. But perhaps his most dangerous flaw was not arrogance. It was his need for flattery. Wealthy businessmen quickly realized that compliments could unlock access to a British prince. This weakness led Andrew into questionable deals. He sold his former home, Sunning Hill Park, to a Kazakh oligarch for £15 million, far above the asking price. The property was left to rot, a silent monument to shady dealings. Money questions circled him constantly. Where did his wealth come from? Who was funding his lavish lifestyle? The answers were murky. It was in this environment of suspicion that Ghislaine Maxwell introduced him to Jeffrey Epstein. To Andrew, Epstein seemed perfect. Rich, connected, and surrounded by celebrities. Epstein provided exactly what Andrew craved: relevance. The fading prince suddenly had access to powerful circles in New York and beyond. Andrew never asked questions, or, if he did, he ignored the answers. Epstein treated him like royalty when Britain increasingly did not. Soon, Andrew became a fixture at Epstein's homes. Flight logs placed him on Epstein's private jet. Witnesses saw him at the New York mansion. Even after Epstein served prison time, Andrew was photographed walking with him through Central Park, smiling as though nothing had happened. For the public, it was unthinkable: a royal prince openly associating with a convicted offender. For Andrew, it was business as usual. He brushed off Epstein's crimes as unfortunate rumors, convinced that his own title would protect him from scandal. But then came the moment he could not escape. Virginia accused Epstein and Maxwell of trafficking her as a teenager, forcing her into encounters with powerful men. One of those men, she claimed, was Prince Andrew. The photograph of Andrew, Maxwell, and Virginia, barely 17, became one of the most damning royal images of modern times. Andrew denied everything. He said he had no memory of meeting her. He insisted he had never been upstairs in Maxwell's townhouse. He even suggested the photo might be fake. But his excuses sounded desperate. Each denial only deepened suspicion. As journalists dug deeper, the scandal grew worse. Reports confirmed that Andrew had stayed at Epstein's New York mansion even after Epstein's conviction. For most people, such behavior was unimaginable. For Andrew, it was simply a convenient place to stay, as more survivors came forward. Andrew's name repeatedly surfaced in court filings and news reports. Suddenly, the spoiled tantrums, the bullying of palace staff, and his obsession with teddy bears no longer seemed childish. They looked like symptoms of something far more dangerous. A man who had never been told no, never faced consequences, and never learned boundaries. The damage was irreversible. Now, what did the monarchy do about his scandals? Was he being pampered, or were they truly cut loose from the son of the Queen? Keep watching as the answer will shock you. The Crown's breaking point. For decades, Britain had tolerated Prince Andrew's reckless ways. His arrogance, his endless appetite for luxury, his womanizing, and his constant indulgence were seen as embarrassing but manageable. The palace believed his flaws could be kept out of the spotlight. But when Jeffrey Epstein entered the picture, everything changed. Suddenly, Andrew was no longer a wayward prince who enjoyed too much privilege. He had become a liability, a danger to the monarchy's survival by 2019. The fall was impossible to ignore. The prince, who once cut a proud figure in naval uniform, walking confidently beside his mother, was stripped of nearly everything that defined his role. Military honors revoked, patronages dissolved. His royal calendar cleared of duties. He was erased piece by piece. What remained was not the image of a royal serving the crown, but of a man standing in the shadow of one of the darkest scandals of modern times. Yet, the true story went deeper than the headlines about photographs and accusations. It wasn't just that Andrew was pictured with a teenager, Virginia, his arm wrapped around her waist, Ghislaine Maxwell smiling in the background. The deeper scandal was about the patterns of power that shielded him for so long. Epstein's circle had always been crowded with influential figures, politicians, billionaires, and world leaders. But Andrew's protection came from the monarchy itself. For years, his position as the Queen's son created an invisible shield that deflected accountability. Whispers began to surface about how far that protection extended. Reports revealed that palace officials had pressured networks and journalists to suppress stories. In 2020, World heard an ABC anchor admitting on a hot mic that she had the Epstein story 3 years earlier. But it was blocked because of the powerful names involved, including Andrew. This wasn't just a prince who had fallen into scandal. This was a system that had covered for him, buying him time and silence that no ordinary man accused of the same. Crimes would have been granted. And then came the disastrous interview. The moment that turned embarrassment into humiliation. In November 2019, Andrew sat down for what was supposed to be a chance to clear his name. Instead, it destroyed what little credibility he had left. Faced with Virginia's allegations, Andrew denied everything. He insisted he had been elsewhere on the night she claimed Epstein trafficked her to him. His alibi? A visit to a Pizza Express in Woking with his daughter. But it wasn't the pizza Express defense that captured the world's attention. It was something stranger, something so bizarre it turned him into a global punchline. Asked about reports that he had been seen sweating profusely while dancing in a nightclub with Virginia, Andrew coolly replied that he couldn't sweat. He explained that during the Falklands War, he had suffered an overdose of adrenaline that damaged his sweat glands, leaving him unable to perspire. The excuse was mocked worldwide. The prince was no longer being discussed in tones of respect or even outrage. He was being laughed at. He became the man who said, "I don't sweat." From that moment on, his downfall accelerated. Public sympathy evaporated. The interview was labeled a catastrophe, not only because of Andrew's answers, but because it revealed his complete lack of awareness. He seemed convinced that his title and his version of events would be enough to silence doubt. Instead, he showed the world exactly what critics had said for years: that he was arrogant, detached from reality, and shockingly unprepared for accountability. The royal family could no longer protect him in the same way. Behind palace doors, a painful calculation was being made. King Charles, now the monarch, understood that Andrew represented more than a personal scandal. He represented a crack in the monarchy itself. For years, the institution had relied on secrecy, and silence. Now the entire structure was being questioned, and so Andrew began to vanish. Reports in 2023 and 2024 revealed that Charles was making deliberate moves to distance himself from his brother. Andrew and his ex-wife Sarah Ferguson were increasingly excluded from family gatherings. Even Christmas at Sandringham, a tradition deeply tied to senior royals, was in question. To keep Andrew visible would be to keep the scandal alive. To erase him was to give the monarchy a chance at survival. Prince William, insiders say, has been one of the strongest voices for cutting Andrew out completely. He understands how fragile public trust in the monarchy has become. And he knows that every time Andrew's name resurfaces, it drags the entire royal family backward. For William, the future of the crown requires sacrifice, even if that means casting aside his own uncle. For Andrew, the message is unmistakable. He is no longer wanted because of a scandal so deep it shook the crown itself. The monarchy had no option but to strip him of royal duties. But how did it all unravel? Stay tuned to uncover the truth. How the monarchy cut Andrew from public life. The boy who once shocked palace guards, kicked horses for fun, and laughed at the pain of staff, believing the world itself bent to his will, was finally learning what it meant to face consequences. That reckless child had grown into a man who could no longer escape accountability. The turning point came in November 2019, just 4 days after his disastrous BBC Newsnight interview with Emily Maitlis. Prince Andrew was forced to make a humiliating announcement. On November 20th, he declared he would be stepping back from public duties for the foreseeable future. It was the first time in modern history that a senior royal had been pushed into semi-retirement. Not because of age, but because of scandal. That infamous interview was supposed to clear his name. Instead, it destroyed him. In it, Andrew clumsily defended his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted offender. He denied ever meeting Virginia, the woman who accused him of abuse. He bizarrely claimed he had been at Pizza Express in Woking on the night in question. And most infamously, he insisted he could not sweat because of a medical condition from the Falklands. War. What he thought was a clever defense became the stuff of ridicule. Overnight, "I don't sweat" turned him into a global punchline. The backlash was immediate. Businesses, universities, and charities raced to cut ties with him. Institutions that had once proudly displayed his patronage now scrambled to erase his name from their records. Even Andrew himself admitted in a statement that his connection to Epstein had become a major disruption to the royal family's work. The Queen, facing pressure from all sides, quietly approved his withdrawal. But the disgrace didn't end there. After Epstein died in 2019 and Ghislaine Maxwell's arrest in 2020, Andrew still refused to set foot in the United States. His lawyers fought hard to block court proceedings. He dodged being served papers until Virginia finally sued him in New York in 2021. That lawsuit was catastrophic. To avoid a public trial, Andrew agreed to a settlement reported to be as high as £12 million. The Queen herself helped finance part of it. He insisted it was not an admission of guilt, but the world saw it differently. A prince had written a check to silence allegations of abuse. The timing couldn't have been worse. Britain was facing economic struggles. The monarchy was still reeling from Harry and Meghan's dramatic exit. And Prince Philip had just died in 2021, when Andrew walked behind his father's coffin. His presence was tolerated, but carefully controlled. Cameras caught him, but the contrast was stark. A disgraced man, walking silently. Far from the proud naval officer and Falklands veteran he once was, by the time Queen Elizabeth died in 2022. Andrew's role had shrunk even further. He was banned from wearing his military uniform during her funeral, allowed only a brief exception. Crowds booed him in the streets. Protesters shouted, "You're a sick old man," and police had to intervene. for the first time in centuries. A British prince could not appear in public without being openly despised. Behind palace doors, King Charles made his stance clear. Andrew begged to be reinstated, even considering legal action to claw his way back. But there was no room left for him. In early 2022, Buckingham Palace stripped him of his remaining military titles and royal patronages. Retry.